Hi. So welcome to our webinar focused on teaching about art and making art. We, Peter Yassi and myself, are delighted to be conducting this webinar as part of a series. We gave an introductory webinar, which is still available to you, introducing fair use, and we won't be repeating most of that information today, but we welcome your revisiting that if we're confusing you in any way about the basics. We will be giving you a few slides that if you've been with us before, you probably will have seen before, just to keep you refreshed about where we're going. But as you know, the College Art Association created a code of best practices in fair use. This is one of the segments. We're going segment by segment through the scenarios, through the situations in the code in which people apply fair use and working through them. We hope to be seeing questions from you come up as we go through, and we hope to be leaving a substantial amount of time for both some testing of our knowledge through some scenarios that we'll give you and some polls that you'll take, and also some question and answer. This is the second to last in this series, and we will be going through some of the issues that you've raised in these first four series, first four webinars, and also entertaining any other questions you may have in that last webinar. And so we really look forward to seeing you again. But what we're going to do now is just walk you through a little bit about what we're going to do. So we're going to remind you about fair use, and then we're going to be talking about why it's so crucial to people who teach about art and who make art. And then we're going to go directly into what the code says about art, and then we're going to about teaching about art, and then we're going to talk about making art. And once we've done that, we are then going to turn it over to you and see how you apply that knowledge, and then we're going to talk about ways in which you can extend your knowledge. So first of all, why is this so crucial? As you know, and you certainly know if you've been through these webinars before with us, the vast majority of people in the visual arts use copyrighted material all the time. And what artists told us in a very extensive survey at the beginning of last year was that most academics, at least 80%, are handling copyrighted material when they do their work a fair bit of the time. Artists say that at least 2/5 of the time, about 40% of the time, they are encountering copyrighted material. And if you just think about that for a minute, it's very interesting, because we think about artists as the beginning of the food chain for copyright here. They're creating original works, but clearly 40% of artists are very conscious about employing copyrighted material. We suspect that many more of them do employ and touch upon copyrighted material in their daily lives as well, but 40% of them are fully aware that they're doing so. So of these two categories of people that we're talking about today, people who teach about art and people who make art, how many of them have had a moment where they said, I am not going to do that because I just am a little worried about the rights issues? Well, the majority of academics do. A significant majority. And possibly the thing that was most interesting to us is that fully 20% of artists also said, I won't do that. And some of them said, I won't make stuff, and some of them said, I won't distribute stuff. And in both cases, and in all cases of either abandoning or avoiding projects, whether they are projects that you did but you don't release, or you decided not to do, this is something in which your mission has not been fulfilled. Here are the things we've heard you worrying about. We heard you worried about getting in trouble, about losing relationships, about having bad publicity, and reputation issues. What we know is that this is basically an act of self-censorship, because the great majority of times that you talked about doing this, you did not tell us that other people kept you from doing it. What was keeping you from doing it was your own insecurity about whether it was going to be okay and whether you would get in trouble, which is a completely legitimate concern. And that is why it's so important to understand about fair use. I'm going to turn this over to Peter.
Great, thank you, Pat. And it's a wonderful introduction to the gist of what we want to talk about today, which is how fair use can help. And again, not to repeat what has been said before, I'll say here only that of the many balancing features in copyright law, the features of copyright law that help to provide meaningful incentives to creators on the one hand and meaningful levels of access for new makers to take advantage of pre-existing material on the other. Fair use, the doctrine that's been around for a century and a half and is now codified in Section 107 of the Copyright Act, is the most important. And the most important thing about fair use is that when it applies, when this fair use right is available for academic or an art maker, for example, to exercise, then the result is a non-infringing use. Fair use isn't permitted infringement or tolerated infringement. It is non-infringing activity. It's activity that the law actually encourages. Now, the next slide tells us something important, which is the information that the Congress has given us about when a given use is or isn't considered fair. And these are considerations that, of course, can arise and occasionally do, although not frequently where these communities are concerned, after the fact in a court, say, when a given use of copyrighted material has been challenged, or more often, and that's the part we're really most interested in, before the fact, when a teacher or an artist is deciding whether to pursue a given project or to let it alone. And the Congress tells us that in coming to that kind of a decision, there are at least, it's not an exclusive list, but it is what we have, 4 considerations to bear in mind. Why are you doing it? What kind of material you're using? How much? And what's the economic harm that your use might generate for or impose on someone else? It's a very capacious list, but a bit confusing when all is said and done. A little hard to translate into practice, which is, after all, the level at which we want most to be able to encounter this doctrine. And so there are various solutions to this uncertainty around fair use, and one of them is, of course, for the courts to be a little clearer than perhaps they have always been. And in fact, over the last 25 years, there's been a remarkable shift in the case law around fair use, and the courts have really simplified, streamlined, and I think clarified the question of what is at stake in fair use decision making. These days, the kinds of fair use situations we're concerned with here today, there are really 2 questions that come up and are resolved in fair use analysis. One is whether the use, the contemplated use or the challenged use after the fact, is a transformative one. Is it for a new purpose? Is something different being done with the material from what it was first offered for? Is it for a new audience? And then if the answer is yes, another question arises, and that is, has the user done the right amount or taken the right amount of material for their use? So if I'm writing a piece of criticism of an epic poem and I'm focusing on a few stanzas, I may not be able to reproduce that whole poem as the appendix to my article, because really it's those stanzas that are the focus. They are the appropriate amount. That's an easy principle to state, not always an easy one to apply, but one worth bearing in mind going forward which is what we've done. Now, there's a third thing that comes up too, and this is important because it's really the foundation of the project that we are describing to you today, the larger best practices project, of which the CAA Code of Best Practices is an included part. These days, we know that when judges deal with a new and challenging fair use problem, something that they haven't got decades and decades of precedential case law to help them to decide, they ask, what does the relevant community think? What do the people who do the kind of work that the defendant claims to be doing think about what's right, what's fair, what's appropriate, what's important in order to fulfill their individual and collective missions in the use of copyrighted material. And those opinions are, of course, likely to be especially influential when they're well documented. So these codes of best practices, of which the CAA code is the most recent, are always organized around topics that arise in our early discussions with members of the community. In this case, those discussions involved many interviews and a big survey, and we learned that the 5 situations in which recurrently members of the visual arts community worry about whether or not they can do what they want, and in many cases feel they need to do without copyright clearance casting its shadow over their project, are these. And we're going to talk today about the second and third of the items on this list. Now, in a moment, we'll show you the pages of the code that deal with the situations that are our topic for today. But before we do, I want to point out that in each of the sections of the code, the 5 sections of which 2 are under consideration today, the same structure is present. The code section begins with a description of the problem area, and that description is very important because the scope of the fair use principle that the code describes is, of course, coterminous with the description of the situation. So we'll talk in a minute about how the 2 situations in which we are, or with which we are concerned today, are described. That description is followed by a brief and fairly categorical statement of the principle being that the application of fair use is relevant to, that fair use can apply in situations like those described. And then we get to what is in some ways the real heart or essence of each subsection of the code, and that consists, of course, of a series of limitations on the fair use principle. These are all things, the description, the statement of the principle, and the limitations that were hashed out in extensive, extended discussions within the visual arts community. They're things that the hundreds of informants that we had helping us with this project were able to agree on with a high degree of confidence, and they have, for that reason, found their way into the code. They are not, however, simply the statements of opinion or preference of the visual arts community. They are more than that, and they are more than that because they have been extensively vetted by lawyers, expert lawyers in the field, who, once we were able to transcribe our understanding of the consensus arrived at by the members of the visual arts community with whom we spoke then took a look at that consensus to see whether it made sense, whether it was within the metes and bounds of the legal fair use doctrine as it exists today. So we're talking about the views of the community about what's right and proper in the reuse of pre-existing copyrighted material, but we're also talking about views that have been tested in the crucible of expert legal analysis, and therefore we think are entitled to a pretty high level of respect. It's pretty robust stuff, in other words.
So in a moment, we're going to return to Peter and the issues that you see on the screen now. But before we do that, I want to turn you over to the web. And feel free to go to the web yourself or to walk along with me as I model how to access the code itself. And then we're going to go back and talk about things you are not going to need to worry about as we work out some challenges together on how to make decisions using the code. But what I'm going to do is go to the Center for Media and Social Impact site. This is my site. Peter has his site, and this College Art Association has their site, and we all have exactly the same material on this site. So the Code of Best Practices is here. I clicked on the Code of Best Practices, and what I'm going to do is go directly to the one that says Teaching About Art. And for those of you who are just seeing a little box, and then also our faces, you might want to expand that little box so that you can focus on this, because you're going to need to either read your hard copy, which if you're looking at me looks like this, or you're going to read along with me as I click on Teaching About Art. So I'm going to expand the text a little bit so that you can see the description. And the description focuses, I'm not going to read this to you. I will give you a minute, but I'm going to point out that here's the three categories Peter was just talking about. Here's the description. This describes what you do when you're teaching. This describes the principle in explaining why fair use applies, and then we get to the limitations. Now I'm just going to scroll down to the limitations and the principle, and I'm going to give you a minute to read the principle and the limitations.
And when you're ready, I have a little bit to say about each of these sections and how you can begin to make use of them. So let's wait a little.
So take a quick scan of this. I'm going to give you 20 seconds. Just get your eyes upon it.
"20 seconds of silence" seems very long somehow.
Okay, Peter, do you want to just hit the highlights here?
That's what I wanted to do.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I just want to make the point, which should be clear to you, that having us explain the code and hitting the highlights and giving you 4 points on a PowerPoint is really not the same thing as your reading it. Your reading it is actually really crucial. You need to understand this.
Jack, can you roll back up for a moment to the description?
Yes.
So the main point I want to make to you about this description, and I said it before in a sense, is that it's very important because it gives you the scope of the application of what went before. And what you will see in the description are a couple of things of importance. One is that it's very general, that the kind of teaching that is covered by this principle isn't just classic teaching in an academic classroom. It includes, of course, the studio-based teaching as well as classroom teaching, and it includes informal teaching as well as formal teaching. So a class at the senior center or an afternoon school class at for kids would be as much a part of the scope of this principle as more formal educational exercises. The other thing that's important to recognize from the principle is that an awful lot of the concerns that people had, in fact, by far the, the main area of concern had to do with the conduct of teaching activities by new means, especially digital means. To what extent can digital tools be used to make examples and illustrations and other kinds of supporting material, both image material and text material, available to students? And so it really is very much on that set of concerns, you could say, if you would, anxieties, that this section of the code focuses. Now, if we move down to the principle, we'll see that it's very broad in its articulation of the applicability of fair use. Fair use applies in a range of formal instructional settings and in the use of material to support teaching in those settings, including online, but not without qualification. And here I want to make a point. We've made it before, I'm making it again, because it is perhaps the most important point of all about how to make good use of this code, and that is that the limitations are absolutely integral to the principle. You can't understand the principle without the limitations. You can't understand the limitations without the principle. And the limitations, as you read through, are of several different kinds. The first couple relate to the notion that the use of material should be substantially justified by pedagogical principles, or I should really say pedagogical purposes or objectives. The third principle talks about the appropriate restriction of student access to course materials. It's a middle of the road position, as so many of the positions expressed by the members of the community who came together to make this code are, but it's one on which there was a very high level of agreement. The next item is an interesting one, and it is interesting in connection also with the last and next to last items on the list. None of these are, strictly speaking, hardcore copyright considerations. Copyright really doesn't deal with the fidelity of reproductions as such. It doesn't deal with the attribution of reproductions as such either. But our professionals, the ones who came together to make this code, felt very strongly that working to make reproductions as good as they can be under the prevailing circumstances and giving credit and additional information where it was possible to do so were significant aspects of professionalism, and that to do so was an important demonstration of the kind of user good faith that is so important in the context of fair use analysis. Finally, we see, and it is the 5th limitation, a very important limitation that has to do with downloadable images made available to students over online applications. And it represents an illustration of something that's significant about this code overall. That is, it doesn't try to prescribe a mathematical metric for the size of images that can be made downloadable to enrolled students in appropriate classes or in appropriate class settings. Rather, it takes a functional approach to that question of image size. It's a critical question. It goes, as you can see from or should be able to see from my earlier discussion, directly to one of the most important legal issues in the context of fair use, that is the amount of material used. But the group felt strongly that because both technology and expectations about technology are in constant flux, it was better to provide a functional standard for this purpose. Overall, as you can see, the goal of the code isn't to describe fixed metrics or permissible or impermissible amounts or actions. This code, like all of the other codes that preceded it, the codes of which it is a family member, a cousin, so to speak, or to which it is a cousin, so to speak, represents an attempt to prescribe or recommend a way of reasoning through fair use problems to a reliable outcome. It won't solve those problems, but it will provide a format by which practitioners in the visual arts, in the case we've just been talking about, teachers, can reason to their own conclusions and defend them once they've been arrived at.
And
now,
Peter, we're running a little bit behindhand, so I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I think you have less than a minute to hit each of these 4 categories. I'm really sorry.
Oh, well, I think I can do that without much difficulty. The first is a question that often comes up, and that is, why do I, as a teacher, need fair use since there's already a piece of legislation, the so-called Teach Act, that deals with online teaching? And the answer is that although the Teach Act is very useful for the relatively narrow range of educationally related uses that fit under it, it describes a relatively small safe harbor. And beyond that safe harbor, fair use is essential to educators. Sometimes, and this will become more clear, I think, when we get to our next heading than it may be perhaps in this one, there is a confusion on the part of would-be users of material from the world about what constitutes copyrighted material and what, on the other hand, is regulated by the law of trademark. But broadly speaking, a text or an art image is most likely, or an artistic image is most likely to be the subject of copyright, but something like a logo or a brand designator is more a matter of trademark law. And broadly speaking, for both the teaching uses that we've just described or the art-making uses that we will describe in a moment, the happy news here is that trademark law is irrelevant. So that's very good news about fair use and about intellectual property law generally. Not so good is the news that is indicated in the third item on this slide. If, as a teacher, for example, or as an artist who is seeking to make new work based on old work, you can't get a reproduction of the pre-existing work that is suitable for your pedagogical or artistic purposes, then you may have to deal with the institution that has the work and can give you the digital file that is suitable for your purposes. That isn't a function of copyright, and it's a function of the fact that for some kinds of material, certain institutions or individuals are the sole sources, but because it's not a function of copyright, it's not something that fair use can mitigate either. And that means, in particular, to go to the last item on the list, that the so-called permissions fees that users occasionally find themselves being asked to pay by, for example, museums that hold material that they want access to, are in fact sometimes fees that they have no choice except to pay. If they can find reasonable substitute materials from other sources, then they may well be able to exploit those under the doctrine of fair use. But if it's truly sole source material, the permission fees may be, or the payment of permission fees may be the only way to get at them.
Great. And by the way, when Peter says exploit, he doesn't mean you're taking advantage of. He means just use. And this is something that I think
that's lawyer talk. Forgive me.
It is really, yeah, it's really important to understand, which Peter emphasized for you at the beginning, that these are rights. They are not, this is not getting away with something. This is what the law wants you to do. Okay, so let's go right into teaching. And this is where, if you have not expanded that little box that has your PowerPoint in it, you really want to expand it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to read this example, because we are about to test our knowledge. We are now turning to you to ask, is this okay? So here we've got a challenge. You are an art teacher, and you've got slides of artworks, and you want to discuss, you've been assigned the intro to art history class, and you've got a whole bunch of slides, and they come from all these different sources. You took some photographs at museums, you took a photograph of something in a book, you got something from friends, you picked it up from websites, okay. And you want to be able to include the sequences that you were talking about in class on your on your Blackboard or your Moodle. So Hillary, could you launch the poll? You are now going to employ the knowledge you just got from Peter and from reading the code, the section on teaching art, and ask yourself, what are the limitations I would ask myself, and generally speaking, do I think this kind of use falls into those limitations? We've got 70%, and I know the rest of you have an opinion. And so now we have 80%, and vote now because we're just about to shut it down. Overwhelmingly, you think that you can do this. There is somebody out there who doesn't think so. And I'm unable to look at questions, but if you have a question, if you are, I'm not sure, or if you are thinking, I can't do this, we'd love to know why you can't do it. And possibly, Hillary, are you seeing any questions? Hillary is managing this whole process.
Okay, I can read some questions. Let's see. So there's a question about, I have heard of a rule of spontaneity for fair use in teaching, that if there is a time to get permission, we must, and if there is time to get permission, we must, and if we are using material even every semester, we must get permission.
Okay, and we'll just take them all at once. Anything else?
Let's see. What if you are working for a for-profit institution?
And?
Those are the ones that were related to the question previously.
Great. Okay. So, Peter, you want to take those two, the spontaneity and the I'm working for.
So, with respect to spontaneity, that's such an interesting and important question, because it is very, that notion is very much embedded in the, how can I say, the old-fashioned advice that has been circulated widely about these issues. And it has a source. There is a line in a document that was part of the legislative history of the Copyright Act of 1976 that refers to the spontaneity consideration in trying to define a fair use safe harbor for classroom photocopying. Now, that document hasn't aged well, nor was it ever intended to be a limit on the reach of fair use. And yet somehow this notion of spontaneity has worked its way into the discourse as if it were a statutory or a judge-made or an agreed requirement, and it's simply not. And if you think about it, it's sort of silly. If the key to fair use is the one that I mentioned earlier, whether the use is justified and whether or not the amount used is appropriate, then it really shouldn't matter and doesn't matter whether the use is a one-off, last-minute use or a calculated, premeditated, and repeated one. So
how about the free for-profit question?
Yeah, I was going to go on to that next and say that there is absolutely no meaningful distinction in the application of the law of fair use between entities that are set up to make money and entities that are set up not to make money. It is important that your entity be one that is a genuinely educational entity. But whether it is constituted as a for-profit or a not-for-profit isn't relevant to the application of this principle. It isn't relevant in terms of the Code of Best Practices itself, and it isn't relevant as far as the applicable law is concerned either.
So I think you guys generally did vote the way that we would vote. And of course, we would be going back to those limitations, and we'd be thinking, okay, I am clearly posting work that is pedagogically related because I want them to take a look at the stuff that we are talking about in class for a reason. I'm not just posting pretty pictures for them, so it's clearly pedagogically linked. And then I'm also going to take a look at what size and the downloadable issues, and I'm just going to go through each of the limitations, and including attribution, where I've got it, where it's appropriate. Don't need to go wild and crazy, but generally speaking, as a teacher, you'd probably want to let them know what that picture was. And I just be to be comfortable. Certainly, the first few times I did it, I would be going through that checklist. Of course, as you go through that checklist of what are the limitations, you begin to be very familiar with the reasoning. And this word reasoning that Peter mentioned is so important. And it becomes part of your background thinking, and you're no longer running to the code every minute to say, wait a second, what about limitation 4? What about limitation 7? Because you've built it into your practice in the same way that you've built your other expressive rights into your practice without constantly checking on them. But the code helps you as you're moving away from that very old-fashioned, well, spontaneity, well, 30 seconds, well, 400 words, well, change it 7 times kind of mythology. As you're moving into the modern era of fair use interpretation, the code helps you get over that awkwardness. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry.
Add one thing, which is that don't I would say maybe what I would say is accept no substitutes, because there are unfortunately a whole myriad of so-called fair use checklists that circulate out in the world and that really don't have any intrinsic merit or inevitability about them, except that they represent the opinion of one person who's more than happy to share it with others. This document is different. This document is not just another fair use checklist. It really is, by virtue of having been generated of, by, and for the visual arts community, a document that we are convinced and others are convinced should be treated as a significant source of guidance.
We need to get on to the teaching, the making art section, but we're going to do a quick poll before we do that on the teaching, because we've talked about somebody who's basically teaching art history, the Intro to Art history class. We also wanted to give you a scenario that was about working in studio art. So let's say you're going to be teaching a unit on still life painting, and you want the students to look at work before they make their own of some focusing on some kind of material that they are going to want to do a still life of. And you want them to get a range of ways that people have looked at it over time. So this is you're asking students to curate a collection of work that will provide some inspiration or show them what they don't want to do. But in any case, you're asking them to think about themselves as artists in a community of artists. So can they just go all over the internet and pull down any picture and put them all together for you and stick them up on the online course site? So that's the question. Again, be thinking about those limitations, be thinking about the purpose. And Hillary, can we ask you to post that poll? And if you are still looking at a tiny little square, this is where you want to expand it if you want to take a look at the written scenario that I just told you about. Okay, we're over half. Keep on going, people.
You know, as you do, let me point out one of the things that's really interesting and important about this principle, and that is triggered by this example, and that is that this is not only about what teachers can do, it's also a principle about what students acting at the direction or request of their teachers can do. And
So
since
Hillary,
so much teaching now is interactive, that's a very important proposition.
Hillary, can we ask you to do a roundup of the questions? Because we have a number of people who are not sure, and we have a number of people who said no. And we'd love to know what are the doubts and decisions that make this not seem as much of a fair use as the first case where the teacher was acting. Is it about the students? Is it about the kind of thing you're asking them to do? Is it about the mean way that I put that last question? Can they just go scouring the internet for this stuff?
Okay, so one was somebody wanted to clarify that they would instruct the students to cite their sources, but would allow it. And then somebody asked if the course site would be password protected or not.
I see. Yes, and we would assume that the online course site is password protected. I love the idea that you're asking them to say where they got it so that they get into the good practice of always attributing, because you know what? Giving people credit is just a little piece of etiquette that seems to smooth the way for people irrespective of the law. Anything else, Hillary?
Well, somebody did ask about the previous question as well about that password protected issue. So maybe you could speak about if it wasn't, what it would be
So
like.
the beauty
Well,
of
I'd like to very much, because it raises a very important point about the way the code works. The cumulative limitations associated with the principles in the code are what the community thinks produces the highest reasonable level of security around a fair use claim. And no one who participated in our discussions felt that merely because a course site was not passworded, that factor in itself was a fatal knockout blow to a claim of fair use. That's not the point. The point is that observance of the limitations individually and cumulatively strengthens the fair use claim. So there may be situations in the world in which a successful fair use claim can be made with respect to material that is made available beyond the enrolled class member and other people associated with the class. But the best argument, the most robust argument, is the one that results when that principle or that limitation, along with other limitations, are observed.
So great. We're going to have to move along. Otherwise, those people who are with us who want to learn about making art are not going to get their moment. But we're going to give you an email at the end where you can ask any questions you like. And if there are questions that we did not answer in this webinar, Hillary will kindly gather them for us, and we will make sure that we answer them in the final webinar. So let's move along to making art. So this is once again where I'm going to drive you crazy by going back to the web, and let's just take a look at the section on making art. So once again,
while you look, let me say a few words in the interest of time about this section, which is a much more economically worded one than the one we just stated. This turned out to be a point of extremely strong and general consensus among all of the participants in the sessions that we held to come up with the consensus that this code reflects. And I want to emphasize that those sessions were sessions in which all kinds of visual arts professionals, including working artists, were strongly represented. In effect, the members of the community felt that because art making had always involved the incorporation of pre-existing themes elements of pre-existing images. There was absolutely no reason to draw a line today which would exclude new techniques of what are sometimes referred to as appropriation art. So, as you'll see from the description, the clause or the scope of the application of the principle is an extremely broad one, and it applies not only to all sorts of work in various media, but also to all sorts of underlying source material, whether from the fine arts or from other copyrighted kinds of material. The principle is easily stated, and the limitations are relatively few. The first two limitations are designed to assure that the project that is going to be justified on the basis of fair use is a legitimate art-making project, not a pretextual effort simply to take commercial advantage of someone else's material. The third limitation is a limitation that applies in situations where there is some risk that, or might otherwise be some risk that, the material that has been created could be seen as fraudulently or deceptively passing itself off as that which it is not. And the third, which is carefully qualified, and those qualifications are themselves worthy of attention, deals once again, no surprise, with the issue of attribution. And that's really all we have here. This was perhaps, of all of the statements that the makers of the code, the members of the community who came together, arrived at, the one about which there was the strongest and the largest immediate consensus.
So we have a few minutes here to run through a couple of examples. And so I want to throw this one out to you. You're now an artist, and you are going to be doing a public artwork. It's going to be available in a public square. If you want to put on a digital display, and you are going to be pulling from news websites around the world, and you have an artistic reason for doing that, and you are going to be drawing in real time, or you would like to. So you're thinking, is that going to be legal? Can I draw from real time? Because I could potentially go create a loop and then try to clear a whole bunch of material. It'd be a nightmare, but is that my alternative? So the question here is, you would really like to make it from real sites in real time, because then you would be making the artistic point you want to make about the continual cacophony of always incoming information. But can you do that? Can you employ fair use to do that? So let's do the poll. And please vote in a hurry. Thank you. Okay, we're winding down. All right, thanks. So 3/4 of you say, yes, this is a case where the code applies, and that logic of transformative use for artistic purposes does apply. 10% of you say, no, the law does not apply here. And fully 15% are not sure. Now, Hillary, again, could you give us an idea of, do we have clues from the questions about why people are not sure about this, or why they think that fair use might not apply?
Would the terms of service for the various news sites factor in, is the one question so far.
Okay, quickly dash off a note to Hillary there on the questions, if you can clarify for us why this is a head scratcher for you.
I can speak quickly to the question of terms of service while we wait, and that is, if the material in question were simply being, as I think the example is designed to say, broadcast or incorporated live as it is being broadcast, the answer would be no, because merely by visiting a site, one can't incur any contractual obligation with respect to the reuse of material at that site. If it were downloaded material, then conceivably the terms of service might matter if, in order to download, you had been required to affirmatively agree to those terms of service.
So one thing that it seemed, I'm sorry, Hillary, did you have?
We have a few more questions if you'd like more.
Yes.
There's one is there a time limit on the use of the news? One person's not sure what the artist would be transforming. And then this might imply the work is original to the artist.
Okay, so I'm sure that Peter, but I think the question of transforming is really, really interesting and important because a lot of people do.
I think that's really important because there is a misunderstanding that sometimes prevails here, and I think it's due in a way to the choice of terms that the courts that came up with this clarifying approach to copyright law employed. We might think in natural language that transforming something meant changing it. But the case law makes it abundantly clear that transformation, transformative use, or transformative purpose can also be demonstrated through recontextualization. And that is, of course, what this artwork might arguably be doing in service of the point that the artist is interested in making about information overload through the creation of this work. One of the things that the code makes clear is that an artist who is interested in taking advantage of fair use is going to be in a better position to do so if he or she can explain or justify the use. That isn't to say that fair use can't apply where the artist doesn't know or isn't willing to explain his or her objectives, but it does say that fair use is more likely to be successful if the artist has a contemporaneous story about how and why the incorporated material is being used. But that use doesn't have to be a physical or virtual transformation in the lay sense. It can also be represented by recontextualization.
So Peter, would you be my lawyer for a second, as the person pretending to be an artist here? Mm-hmm. I would think I don't need to worry about people being confused about whether I'm the original author of this material that's showing up on my digital display, because I'm showing this overlapping set of news from news sites, and they constantly brand themselves. They either have a watermark or they announce who they are every 2 seconds.
I think that's right. I don't think that attribution and or avoidance of confusion are issues in this case. These are, in effect, self-attributing items. If, on the other hand, I were trying to make a similar point with a large number of still images that I had pulled off the internet, and I knew that some of them were AP images and some of them were Vice images or whatever, then I might want to provide somewhere in the labeling of the work a reference to the fact that those images are sourced in that way.
So we are running up towards the end of the time, and we're not going to have time to do more of our questions, which is heartbreaking to us. But I wanted to take us back to the site before we end, because this set of resources, which those of you who've been with us in the past have seen before, are really particularly useful for teaching because, for instance, you have a PowerPoint that uses many of the slides we've given you here, which you can adapt, make your own, where there's no need for you to say, even, and from our perspective, where you got them. Feel free to just make them part of your teaching. There's little quizzes that you can give students to try out their own knowledge in class. There's a video that lets you introduce us, Peter, myself, and others who are leading spokespeople from the College Art Association, introduce the topic for your students so that you don't have to be the local copyright expert. And probably the thing that might be particularly valuable to you is this really long list of frequently asked questions. We suspect that this list of questions is definitely not complete about teaching, and we think that some of the questions that came up today are going to be answered here. Some of them might not be. So if you have more questions that come up from this, we really want to be able to know so that we can write answers. This is a question. I teach art history. Don't I already have an exemption for teaching in the Copyright Act? This is a question that you might want to go to if you have questions about the Teach Act or your educational exemptions. And if you think, well, does this just apply to the classroom itself, or what if I'm giving a workshop somewhere? You might want to go here. But also, you might want to tell us questions that you think should be in there.
Very much so.
So these are the websites. I was at this one. You can go here too. This is a really very different, very pretty looking website, but it has exactly the same content. You might want your students to become familiar with the collegeart.org website in any case. So definitely go there. Give us feedback on what materials you want to be able to teach better and what questions you have about making art. We want to remind you, as we have in the past, that this code is only as useful in the world. This code is only as useful in the world as you put it to use. And it only becomes useful when people think that their colleagues are using it. So you are an early adopter by definition because you're on this webinar. So you are absolutely on the front lines of the hippest people who know about this new resource. And so we hope that you're going to tell people in your program, and you're going to be like, have you seen this? Because we could use this. We hope that you teach people about it. We hope that you talk to your publishers, that you talk to your gallerists. And if you belong to an organization that might be able to endorse this, well, hello. Because here's the deal. Fair use becomes more vigorous and more useful to people the more people use it. That's been true with the First Amendment generally, and that's true here. So we'd love for you to let us know more because we will learn from you and these resources will grow. This is the email you can write to with any feedback. We're also going to be giving you an evaluation form, but this is where you can be asking questions. You can ask questions like, can I get somebody to come and talk about this in my class? You can ask, why isn't there a question on X? You can tell us, I need PowerPoint slides on this topic. We would love to know that. This is the golden moment where we're creating the package that will help you. So we really appreciate your hanging out here today. We see that 150 of you hung with us. We're very, very grateful to you. We hope to see you at the final session, where I hope that you will submit questions beforehand so that we can really answer your questions. You are all now official fair use experts, and so we want to get into all the nitty-gritty that you have to get into in the final session. Thank you very much.